Okay, well, welcome back, folks. I'm on the next page in your handout that has named and unnamed women in the New Testament. So I'm going to take you a little bit behind the scenes and tell you this is what I did to get where I got. Okay? So what I wanted to do is find all the women in the New Testament and then just look at what they were doing. And so the first thing I did was I just started writing down terms that refer to women, like woman, girl, female, mother, daughter, and then compiled this list, okay? And then looked up all the passages where they're mentioned, okay? Go ahead and turn the page. And then that led to this list of 45, and that list of 45 is fluid in some sense. For instance, some of the women that are named in the New Testament are Old Testament women, right? Like Eve, Hagar, Rachel, Rahab. Some of the women that are mentioned may not be actual, may not be their actual name. You know, so you have a Jezebel. Is she called a Jezebel because she's acting like Jezebel, or was that her real name, Jezebel? Candace in Acts 8:27, that's a title, not a name there. And you'll notice that we have, beginning with number 22, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Marys. Very, very popular name. And are any of those same Marys the same person? Okay? So there's a question about number 26, Mary, the wife of Clopas. Is she the same person as number 25? Okay? So it's not a perfect list, but it's a pretty good list. Yeah? And it was easy to look at female names, okay? And female terms like girl or woman. But then at the same time, I still felt like I was missing some women. And so the other category I have is perhaps not named well. I call them invisible women. They're women that I think are in the text, but I may have missed them, or it might be easy to miss them, or I don't think people see them very often. So, for instance, I'm going to read the first few verses of the Gospel of Luke, and there are no named women there. There are no female terms like mother, daughter, grandmother, okay? But I think there's some women. You see if you hear any women or not, okay? Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account of you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you have been informed. Did you see any women? Witnesses, yeah, the eyewitnesses there. Now, we've read the rest of the Gospel of Luke, and we know that there are women that start following Jesus in Luke chapter 8, and we hear about them again in 23 and 24, and it mentions the women that have followed him from Galilee, okay? And we have women all along that are eyewitnesses to things that happen with Jesus. Now, you may not necessarily think women when you're reading Luke 1, 1 through 4, when you read eyewitnesses, but they're included, okay? There's another way in which women might be concealed, and part of this is due to language, which we also get in other languages like French and Spanish. So if I'm speaking to a group of teachers, and they're all male, what is the gender of the noun there? Male, okay. If I'm speaking to a group that's all female, it's going to be female. What if I'm speaking to a group of teachers that has both male and female? Male. So, if we have male, we don't know if it's all male or if it's male and female. With some of these theys, some of these plurals like teachers, it could be including females, because that's the way the language works, right? And we may not necessarily think of that. Probably the best example of that is a term that It's probably variously translated in your Bibles. Brethren or brothers, okay? Some translations have brothers or sisters. Now, and sisters is not in the Bible. Why would they put and sisters there? Because they look at the church at Corinth and they know that there's some women there, and then Paul is addressing the whole church. He's addressing males and females. And that's one of the ways that you would do it. Because if you have a mixed group, you use the male one, right? Okay. So that's why your translation would have brothers and sisters, even though the word literally is brothers, plural, male. Okay? So there's going to be some places like that, and I'll name a couple others. So I have Luke 10:1 here. After this, Jesus appointed 70 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. In my mind, growing up, we had things like phonographs, okay? And little pictures on stories we got sent home with us. And in my mind, when Jesus sends out the 70, they're guys, okay? Is it possible that some of those pairs could have been husband and wives? We later find out from 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that Peter traveled with his wife and some of the other apostles traveled with their wives as they do ministry. Could they have started as early as this? Possibility. Could it have been two women that are traveling together? We have a trifina and a trifosa that are mentioned in Romans. Could you have had a pair of females? I'm not saying that there were, but I'm saying that there's a possibility there in the text. Another passage, the road to Emmaus. Jesus is walking along with 2 folks. In your mind, what do they look like? They're 2 guys. If your mind is like my mind. Because that's what you saw growing up, right? We know that one of them is named Cleopas. Okay, so one of them is a guy. So we do have some information about that. But when they urge him strongly, stay with us, it's nearly over. It's nearly evening and the day is almost over, and he went in to stay with them. Could it have been a husband and wife? They were walking along and invite Jesus to stay in their house. It's possible, right? Am I saying that I definitely know that it was? No, I'm not. I'm saying there are some places where I have default modes, I have presuppositions, I have my own background where I've heard this story so many times that I just see this, that it's a possibility that, yeah, you might have a husband and wife there, okay? So when we have those texts where there's possibilities, I'm going to try and put a question mark to let you know that I know that we don't know the other person there is male or female, okay, either one. But just to raise some possibilities, okay, and to make us more aware. The other examples are things that we talked about. So the Philippians 1:1, the overseers and the deacons, plural, that's going to be male. So could you have female deacons there? You could. Do we know? No, we don't. Okay? But that's an example. Same with the brethren and the teachers that you find elsewhere. Okay. I don't want to spend too long with that, but I also want to explain question marks that you'll see and some of the invisible women that I described. Okay, so what I did is I chose 10 different functions. You might sort those 45 plus women in different ways. When we go through this, you might be saying, no, it should be 11, or it should be 12. 10's a nice number, okay? So I'm not saying this is exhaustive. We might sort it different ways. But these are 10 functions that I think are important for us to consider. I'm going to work through these in a fairly expeditious way. So I'm on the page that says 10 functions women perform in the New Testament. Number 1, female deacons. Okay? So in Romans chapter 16, we meet a woman named Phoebe. And Phoebe, in those first 2 verses of Romans, is described as a diakonos. And so if you get out your Greek English dictionary and you look at diakonos, you see that there are some options for how to translate it. Sometimes it's translated servant, like it's probably translated in your Bible in the previous chapter in Romans chapter 15, verse 8, where Christ is called a diakonos, a servant. Sometimes it's translated ministry. And I suspect in those passages there, your Bible probably has diakonos being translated as ministry. And sometimes, relatively few times, it's translated as a deacon. You can see those 3 other places there. And so how do you decide how to translate it? It's going to be context. That's the most important thing that translators can consider is what's the context. And so what we have here is we have Paul commending our sister Phoebe. She's called a diakonos what? Of the church. So her diakonos is related to her church, and her church is located at Cenchrea, which is one of the two port cities for Corinth. And he commends, in order that purpose, they may receive her as befits saints and help her, whatever she may need, because, for reason, she's helped many and myself as well. So, one of the other things that we can do in trying to figure out what a diakonos is to kind of look up the word origin, like what's its root come from, okay? And so you look up the word origin for the root diakonos, and it has derivation unknown, which is really disappointing as a New Testament person, because you thought you were right at something and you struck out, okay? So the next thing you do is you look at the company that word keeps, okay? And it turns out that diakonos is a very common word in the first century, and it keeps company with words like slave and servant, and so it's really easy to figure out what a diakonos is. A diakonos is someone who serves, okay? So if Phoebe's a deaconess, why didn't he just call her a deaconess? Well, it turns out that there wasn't a female form of the word deacon, deaconess. The male did both in church writings and in pagan writings. Okay? Until quite late. Okay? It isn't until the 300s that you actually start to get a specific female diaconess term. Okay? Notice that Paul places the church as her area of service. And so the question that comes to mind here is, okay, if this person were named Phoebus, male, instead of Phoebe, female, how would you translate it? And I think most folks would translate it as deacon. Okay? And so it's probably what we have here is Phoebe functioning as a diakonos, someone who serves in the church. And so even though I grew up with deacon being kind of an office in the church, a deacon describes someone who serves. Okay? It's not an especially high-ranking position. In fact, lots of folks are called diakonos in the ancient world, and they're servants who are doing stuff. And so diakonoi, deacons, are folks who have been designated by the church in an area of service that they happen to be good in, that would be helpful for the church to serve. Okay, we also have some women in 1 Timothy 3:1 that are mentioned. And depending on your translation, it's either translated wives, because they could be wives of deacons, or it could just be women, and they could be female deacons. And what's interesting is I grew up with them being thought of as wives of deacons. But things that don't seem to make sense is, why would there be qualifications for the wives of deacons, but not for the wives of elders? In other words, if those women there are the wives of the deacons, and it's really important for them to be really good people, wouldn't it be even more important for elders' wives to be really good people? And you're not going to say anything about elders' wives, but you're going to say something about deacons' wives? That seems kind of strange, right? And that was one of the reasons why folks said, okay, it could be translated wives, but it also could be translated women, because those words are the same in Greek. And if it's women, then it's talking about female deacons. Well, if it is talking about female deacons, one of the things that's interesting to note, if you compare the description in verse 8 of the men, the very first word is, depending on your translation, serious. Okay? The very first word for the women is same thing, serious. The second word for the men is about their speech. They're not double-tongued. The second description with the women is about speech, not being slanderers. And the third one for the men is about being moderate, not addicted to much wine. The third one for the women is about moderation and temperance. It looks like there's a very parallel list of characteristics for upstanding men who would be considered for a deacon, and upstanding women who would be considered for a deacon, and it's moving in very parallel kinds of kinds of ways of it. The very first word being exactly the same. Now, I'll mention one other woman here that's probably not someone you thought about. Her name is Apphia, and she's mentioned in the first 2 verses of the book of Philemon. Okay? And I always thought of Apphia, in the few times that I did think about Apphia, as Philemon's wife. Okay? And up until my time at ACU, that worked. But when I got to ACU, we actually read Philemon Greek, and the you there is singular, and so it talks about the church that meets in your house, Philemon, and doesn't include Apphia as part of it. So she doesn't get to be Mrs. Philemon, because you look at other places where you have married couples like Aquila and Priscilla, it talks about the church in their house, because both of them live in the house as husband and wife. So she doesn't get to be Mrs. Philemon. So who is she? We don't know, but she could be a deacon. And why would some people think that she's a deacon? So when Paul writes letters, the very first thing he has is a greeting or a salutation. Okay? Paul to the church at Rome, greetings. And usually he greets the churches as a whole. The only groups that are mentioned in Paul's greetings are bishops and deacons in Philippians 1:1. And so some folks have said, if Paul is greeting a group of other folks, how do we figure out who they are? Well, let's look at Paul's other letters, and when he does that, he's greeting elders and deacons. So Apphia, interestingly enough, is mentioned before Archippus, okay? And some folks have said, could they be deacons? Could they be elders? Okay? And then you get the deacons plural in Philippians 1:1 we're talking about. So, now the last piece of evidence comes outside the Bible, which you might think, well, I don't like that. But you're going to like it more if I tell you a little bit about it. So, it's about someone named Pliny, okay? And Pliny just became Roman governor. And he goes off to Bithynia, which is a province in the northern part of Turkey. And he goes there around 112. Why are we going to say that? Well, because he becomes governor in 112 and he dies in 113. So I'm going to split the difference and say we're pretty close around 112. And when he goes there, he writes a letter to the emperor, and in that letter he describes Christians. And so we have someone who is non-biased. He's not Church of Christ. He's not Baptist. He's not Presbyterian. He's not Methodist. He's not Catholic. He didn't have a horse in this race, okay? And he's describing Christians, and he describes the deacons, okay? So, near the bottom of the next page there, this made me decide that it was all the more necessary to extract the truth by torture from 2 slave women whom they call deaconesses. So, early in the 2nd century, we have churches described, and it mentions there being deaconesses. And we also get deaconesses later in the church too. And one of the things the deaconesses did was they participated in the baptism of women. Because, at least in some churches, baptism involved removing of their garments, and churches thought, it would be better if we had women baptizing women when they remove their garments. And so we read about that in church history. So we have some evidence within the text, we have some evidence in early church history, and then we have some evidence from a pagan who decided to come out and help his Christians. Okay, female patrons. I'm looking at number 2 there. If you would ask in the church that I grew up in, okay, so Jesus goes around for 3 years and he's doing ministry. How does he pay for all this? It doesn't seem like there's any indication of how he could do all that for 3 years and not have a job. Right? Interestingly enough, we were very much a book, chapter, verse kind of crew there. And Scripture actually mentions at least one way in which Jesus paid for his ministry. So look at Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. And in the first few verses of chapter 8, he describes the 12 that are traveling around with him. And then as he continues in the first few verses of chapter 8, he says, there were 12 with them, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means. Okay? So part of the financing of Jesus' ministry was done by women who traveled along with him. Now, would that be a strange thing in the first century? Do we have female patrons in the first century? Yes, we do. Because what we have is women who tended to marry men who were about 10 years older than them. Okay? And the average lifespan in the first century, which we know from grave inscriptions in Ostia, the fourth city of Rome, is in the early 30s, 33 to 35 average. Okay? So you have a lot of men dying, which leads to a couple things. Widows mentioned in the New Testament quite frequently. Okay? And then two, you have widows, you have women who have money. Okay? And this is going to sound really strange, but in the first century, if you wanted to build something and you built something and someone gave it to you, they would put your name on the building. Okay? People don't do that now, but back then they really loved it. Okay? And so it makes it easy to find out if there are female patrons, because we find women's names out there as donating to this. And so the idea of a female patron in the first century, that is not a strange idea. Now, did I grow up with that as I went to church and heard Bible stories? Did we read Luke 8? Yeah. But that wasn't part of the story when we read Luke 8. Right? Was female patrons, or how Jesus funded his ministry. And we're not quite sure why that is, because we were very book, chapter, verse kind of folks. You know, read through the Bible in the whole year was a good goal to have, right? So it's not a strange idea in the first century. So might we find some other women who qualify as patronesses in the New Testament? Yes, we might. So what did I do? Well, I looked up the word for patroness, which is also translated helper and sometimes ruler or governor. And it turns out that Phoebe is also described with this noun, prostatis. And it could just be described here as a helper. A much stronger translation describing Phoebe could be a ruler or governor. It doesn't seem to fit the context there. It seems like she's helping Paul and many others. And the fact that she lives in Cenchrea, this port city through which lots of people are going as they go across this little narrow piece of land with this big city in the middle Corinth. Okay? We know of other patronesses there that were not Christians. It seems likely that Phoebe functioned in some way as a patroness there. And then I looked for all those women that I looked up at the beginning. Are any of them connected with money at all, okay? Or prominence, social class? And so in Thessalonica, you have not a few prominent women who are converted to Christianity, and a number of prominent Greek women in Berea. And so the way the first century worked was called a patron-client kind of relationship, okay? And if I were to summarize it, it's basically you scratch my back, I scratch yours, okay? I'm going to help you out, but I expect you to show me some things in return. And usually the helping out was in, I need money, you'll give me money, but then you need some things that I can't give you, like money, but you need people to show up when I give a speech, because I'm running for office. It'd be really nice if there were people out there clapping after my speech, right? And so if I am a client and I receive money from my patron, I'm going to have some duties to be assigned by that patron. So I'm thinking that if pagans who had money helped other people who didn't have money in the first century, that Christians who had money probably also helped people in the first century who needed funds. Okay? And so if that's the way the economy was structured, I'm assuming that when we have women of high social class, like we have in Thessalonica and Berea, they also likely function as patrons. Do I know that? No. That's why I put likely. Okay? You have Chloe, who's mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1, possibility there, put a question mark. We have women who are named as hosts of house churches, I put a question mark there. If you're a host of a house church, does it also mean you're providing some patronage in some way? Probably. You might get into some definitions there. Okay, number 3 sounds like some weird Dan Brown movie or something, right? Okay, you know, the 13th apostle was really a woman, or something like that, and you're watching this movie and then running through Rome and going through secret caves and stuff like that. It's not that shocking, okay? What you do get is you do get this woman named Junia. And here's the issue with Junia. In Greek, where you put the accent mark and what the accent mark is determines whether you have a boy name or a girl name, okay? So that sounds easy. You just look at the accent mark, except Greek manuscripts don't have accent marks, okay? That's something that's added later. So we have a name, it could be a boy name, it could be a girl name. So what is the evidence for it being a girl name, Junia, rather than a boy name, Junius? Number 2 there. The first writer to think this person, Junia, was male, came in the 1200s. I mean, the first 1,000 years of Christian history, no one thought this was a boy. They all thought it was a girl. And if this person is named Junius, we have no record of anyone ever having that name in all of ancient literature and in all the inscriptions, Latin or Greek. So is it possible that there was a boy named Junius? Sure, that's what the name would have to be if it's accented that way. Do we know of any other male named that in all of our history? No, we don't. Okay? Whereas the name Junia is a very common female name, and I must collected a bunch of examples of that. So, what does it mean to call Andronicus and Junia apostles? That sounds kind of like, right? So, if you look up apostolos in the New Testament, you'll find that, yes, you have the 12, but you have some other folks that are called an apostolos. And your translation usually doesn't have apostle, it usually has something like delegate, messenger, missionary. The most obvious one is Epaphroditus there in Philippians, who is called an apostle because he's sent forth and does something for the church at Philippi. So yes, there are apostles like the 12, okay? But there are also apostles like people who have been sent forth on some kind of mission. And my sense is that Andronicus and Junia, probably husband and wife, were sent out by the church at Rome. They did a really good job with what they were sent out to do, and Paul commends them for their service as apostles. So even though number 3 sounds like it could be kind of like a big wow kind of thing, it's probably not. Well, I mean, it probably is. I mean, they are commended by Paul for being good messengers of the church, so it's not nothing. Are there any other female apostles, any other women who are sent forth? Sometimes people point to the 70, which could have included women, but we don't know. So I'm going to put a question mark there. Sometimes people call the women who are sent to tell the apostles that Jesus is risen, they're the apostles to the apostles. Okay, maybe. But the term isn't actually used. So I have question marks after those, just to let you know that you might read some discussions about them, but the term is not actually used. Okay, the fourth thing that I see women doing is you see women in husband-wife teams. You're not surprised about this because we've already talked about 2 of them already. Okay, we talked about Priscilla and Aquila, and I mentioned Andronicus and Junia. So the interesting thing about Priscilla and Aquila is they are mentioned 4 times, 6 times. 6 times, and 4 of the times that they're mentioned, her name comes first. Okay? And why that's significant is because the boy name usually came first. Like we usually say something like Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, okay? Mr. and Mrs. Smith, okay? It'd be weird to hear Mrs. and Mr. It just doesn't flow the same kind of way. It's not the way you've heard it. And same way in the ancient world. Unless the woman has some kind of prominence. She's wealthier, she's more educated, she has a higher social class, some kind of prominence. And so the fact that Priscilla is mentioned first 4 out of 6 times that this missionary couple are mentioned, seems like she had some kind of prominence of some type. It's hard to tell what it might be, but that's not insignificant. With the other couple, The husband, Andronicus, is mentioned first, and so it seems like we have one couple where the husband's mentioned first, the other couple where the wife's mentioned first. So, what did I do next? From that list of all the women that I assembled, I looked for ones that came in twos. Why did I do that? Well, because Jesus sent out people 2 by 2. And you might find some other ministry teams if I look at people that come in twos. And so we have Tryphena and Tryphosa that are described as workers in the Lord in Romans 16, verse 12. And so they might have formed a ministry team. Because their names are so similar, I kind of think of them as twins with similar names. May or may not be. And then there are 7 other places where I found pairs mentioned. Joanna and Cusa, we have the 70 that are sent out in pairs, Cleopas and the companion. I put question marks after all of those. The brothers and their wives is probably the one that's the most sure. So, when you think of a spectrum of no way did that happen to yes, definitely that happened, and possibly, and probably, and maybe, those question marks fall within that possibly, probably kind of range, right? I'm going to say probable, the brothers of the Lord and their wives or from ministry teams. I'm going to say possible with some of those other ones, okay? Number 5, we see females as hosts of house churches. We also see men as hosts of house churches, and I list those down. We see Mary in Jerusalem. We see Lydia in Philippi. Priscilla and Aquila in 2 places. Very hospitable folks. When they have their house in Rome, they're hosts. When they have their house in Ephesus, they're hosts. We have Nympha, who is likely in Colossians 4. And I'm going to say Phoebe's possible as well. I mean, she has this house in this port city, Cenchrea. She also could have been host of the house church. So it wouldn't be a strange thing for men or women to use their physical belongings, like a house, to help the church have some place to use. We don't actually get church buildings until much later in church history. Okay, look at us. We're at number 6. We're actually going to do this. So, female co-workers. So, Paul explicitly describes some folks with the term sumergos, a co-worker, a fellow worker. So what I did, I looked up all the places in the New Testament where you get this word used. And you get some men that are mentioned, and I list those down at the bottom of the footnote. And you get 3 women, which is kind of interesting, that Paul calls his co-workers. One of whom we've met, Prisca, and her husband Aquila, as co-workers, risked their life, or necks, for Paul's life. And then we get 2 that show up in Philippians chapter 4, verses 2 through 3. And this will be interesting for our purposes. Paul says of them, they struggled side by side with me in the gospel. Okay? Now, the word gospel can either refer to the content of the gospel, okay? Or it can refer to the act of proclaiming the gospel. Okay? So which of these makes better sense? They struggled side by side with me in the content of the gospel, or they struggled side by side with me in the proclaiming of the gospel? The second is much more likely and fits with this use of the phrase in the gospel that you find elsewhere in Romans 1:9 and 1 Thessalonians 2. So if you're looking for women who are spreading the gospel, Euodia and Syntyche are prime kind of candidates. Okay? Number 7, female laborers. If you look at Romans 16, it looks kind of boring because it's just like a list of names, like the church directory or something like that. But from that, we see some females show up, and I'll highlight 4 that are described as laborers. So in Romans 16, not Acts. In Romans 16 and verse 6, we get Mary described in the following way. Read Mary, who has worked hard where? Among you, the Church of Rome. So it's not just she's being praised because, wow, that Mary, she's a hard worker. Okay? Now, she has worked hard among you, church at Rome. So her service is working hard in the context of the church. Okay, look at verse 12. Greet those workers, and what kind of workers are they? In the Lord kind of workers. Okay? Trifida and Tryphosa. So their work is in the Lord kind of work. It's church kind of work. Right? They aren't just hard workers because they make amazing vases. You should see them. Oh my gosh. No. They're hard workers because of their in the Lord kind of work. So we get the context of that. And the same thing in verse 12 with Persis. Read Persis, who has worked hard in the Lord. Okay? So, yes, the word work, labor, can mean what it means, look like a job. But it can also refer to the work of ministry. And Paul uses this term in ministry, and I give you both other verses there that you can look at as well. But here's the rub. I mean, here's where this gets kind of interesting. You're saying, okay, where's the payoff? I've listened to you for like the last 3-4 minutes about co-workers and laborers, but I'm not feeling fulfilled. Okay, turn to 1 Corinthians 16, and let's see if we can do something with that. So, in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 15, Paul says, now, brethren, you know the household of Stephanus. They were the first converts in Achaia. They devoted themselves to the service of the saints. I urge you to be subject to such ones, and to every, two things, what? Co-worker, fellow worker, and laborer. Every person who has the designation of co-worker and laborer, you should be subject to them. Do we know if women who are co-workers and laborers who have that designation? Yeah, we do. And so here's one of the few places where you actually have folks in the church being called to be subject to roles that women had in the early church. If a woman has the role of co-worker laborer, you should be subject to them. Right? And so that's where kind of the nice payoff comes with looking at those passages that you thought don't look that interesting. The 1 Corinthians 1 is where we can see the payoff. Okay. Female prophets. We'll spend some more time tomorrow talking about female prophets when we talk about female preachers. And what I did here was I looked up prophets, prophetess, and it turns out there's quite a few, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Miriam, you get Deborah, who most of us probably remember being called both a judge and a prophet. The one that was new to me was Huldah. I hadn't heard of her. So the book of the law is found in the temple, and they come and they say, what should we do? Okay? Should we go and find the priest? Should we go find the king? So they go, they find the king, and the king says, go get Huldah, who is going to tell us what to do. He's going to tell what the people of Israel should do. She is going to deliver the authoritative word for the people of Israel in terms of their actions toward God. And that wasn't the story that I had grown up with. It was a really good story. We have Isaiah's wife, which could mean that she's the wife of a prophet, or could mean she's a prophet. Folks are a little bit divided on that one. I kind of think she's a prophet. You get some false prophetesses, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament there. You get Anna mentioned in Luke 2. You get women in Acts 2 with the quotation from Joel, so we're not surprised in Acts 21 when Philip has 4 daughters who prophesy, because we just had this long quotation from Joel saying that your menservants and your maidservants are going to prophesy, and lo and behold, we find 4 daughters of Philip who prophesy in Caesarea. We have women who pray and prophesy in 1 Corinthians 11:5. We have Elizabeth, who's probably a prophet, but maybe not. If you compare how she's described in 141 and how her husband is described, it's very similar, but there's a little bit of difference. And so folks are a little bit divided on that. So we'll talk about that more if you want. We'll have the women in 1 Corinthians 14 we'll talk more about, and we get false prophets. Okay. So, one of the reasons why I ended up being doctoral was because I wanted to be able to read a text, say 1 Corinthians, and hear it in the same way that someone sitting in Corinth would have heard it. When they hear about slavery, when they hear about marriage, what's going on in their heads? I wanted to have that same what's going on in their heads. I wanted to hear 1 Corinthians as they would have heard it. Okay? So I did most of my work in kind of understanding the Greco-Roman context of the first century, what people wore, ate, taught with philosophy, did with religion, just trying to understand social practices, marriage and slavery, so I could enter into that world. And so what I often do, as I'm trying to understand a text, is just kind of enter into the world and imagine, okay, so let's say I'm in Corinth, and someone's prophesying. What does it look like? Okay? So, let's look first at Acts chapter 15, because we get a little bit of description of what it looks like. As we're kind of standing beside these fellows, walking along. Okay? Acts chapter 15, verse 30, they're sent off from Jerusalem, from the Jerusalem conference. They go down to Antioch. They gather the congregation together. Verse 30. Okay? They deliver the letter. Verse 31. And when they read it, they rejoiced at the exhortation. And Judas and Silas, who were themselves prophets. Okay. Now, what are the verbs that tell us what the prophets do? They exhorted the brethren with many words and strengthened them. So we get two actions, exhorting and strengthening, encouraging and strengthening, and it's with many words. So it's more than just, nice job, way to go get them. Okay? It's with many words. It's an extended kind of exhortation, an extended kind of strengthening that happens that prophets do. Okay? So we get some insight into what it might look like when a prophet is speaking. Okay? Now let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. And I'll go ahead and pick up in verse 3. It's talking about tongue speakers and prophets. First talks about tongue speakers, verse 2, verse 3. On the other hand, the one who prophesies speaks to men, the word is anthropoi, people, for their, and we get three things, upbuilding, encouragement, and consolation. So when a prophet speaks to gather body of people for building, encouragement, consolation. Now, going on to verse 5, I want you all to speak in tongues, even more to prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, in order that the church may be edified. And so, edification is part of what a prophet does. And so, if you turn the page, you can see a little chart that I made a long time ago now. That kind of summarizes what we just did. In Acts 15, the context is we have a congregation gathered, as well as in 1 Corinthians 14. The actions, exhorting, strengthening, upbuilding, exhortation, comfort, edifying, instruction, teaching. Length, many words. Sometimes it implies a revelation, and it implies they have control, because control is required. So, in the world that I grew up in, when I heard, and this is a pretty crude illustration, but we're going for it, folks. Prophets and preaching would have been two different things. They do not overlap. Okay? On the other hand, if I hear of someone in the gathered body of believers speaking, and there's exhortation, there's strengthening, there's upbuilding, there's comforting, there's edifying, there's instruction, that sounds like what? Preaching. So, am I saying that the world that I grew up in, where these two things were totally different, has now become this, and they're totally the same? No, I don't think so. Because there's some things about prophecy that involve some forthtelling. So if you see Agabus in Acts chapter 11 and Agabus in Acts 21, there's some forthtelling there. that doesn't actually fit with what you probably do in terms of predicting things that are going to happen, that seem to happen with prophets. But the bulk of the activities seem to overlap a lot. So I don't think my world that I grew up in looks like this anymore. But I don't think it looks like this either. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that when you look at the activities that a prophet did and what I think of as preaching, there's a whole lot of overlap there. If you look at the actual verbs that are used describing the actions that they're doing. So that if I were in Corinth and I were seeing a prophet prophesy, it would probably look a lot like what we think of as preaching, given the description of building, comforting, teaching, edifying, exhorting, so forth. So that will be important at some point. And at some point is, this point is just the descriptive thing. I'm just describing what we see in the text. I'm not saying we should do it, we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying, here's what the text says. Here's all the women I could find in the New Testament. Here's the kinds of things I see them do. At some point, we have to ask what we do with that, okay? We're not at that point. We're just describing what we see, okay? Because, as we know, interpretation comes into play. Okay, I'm not going to say much about female prayer because I want to say something about female teachers. And I'm going to pick one that has a question mark after it, because you might not give her full credit for what she's doing, okay? As opposed to the ones where it actually calls her a teacher or mentions them teaching. Prophets are described as teaching, right? Teaching and admonishing that happens through singing. Older women teach, Priscilla teaches, Apollos. But look at Luke 2:38. You know Acts 2:38, right? Look at Luke 2:38. It's kind of an interesting verse. In Luke 2, verse 37, you get Anna described as a widow. Okay, it says she didn't depart from the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer day and night. Verse 38, and coming up at that very hour, she gave thanks to God and spoke of him to all who were looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. So, we have Anna. She's female. She's a prophet. And where is she? She's in the temple. How do you know that? She never left the temple. Okay? And in verse 38, she gives thanks to God, and she speaks about him. Who's the him? Jesus. To whom? Everyone who is what? Interested in spiritual kind of things, looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. So you have a woman in the temple speaking to everyone about Jesus who is interested in spiritual kind of things. Does it mention teacher there? Does it mention preacher there? No, it doesn't. That's why you get a little question mark after that. Because I should have had 11 categories, right? Rather than just 10, and not put her in number 10 in the teaching. But there's something going on there. There's something going on there, right? And we find a similar kind of thing with another woman that I'm not going to tell you about. You'll have to go home and read about her yourself, because it's 8:48. She is the woman with the well. And read about what's said about her in John 4, 29 through 30, 39 to 42. You have 1, 2, 3, 4 verses as your homework. What we'll do tomorrow is, in the morning, we'll look at female preaching. In the afternoon, we'll look at female elders more specifically. Right? Okay? I want to, one, commend you for one, two, for being attentive the whole time. Thank you. And three, send you home on time, so you'll come again. So go home and get some rest. And I'll complete our time. Our God, we're thankful for the ways in which you bless us with your word. We're thankful for the richness that we have as your children. We're thankful for our brothers and sisters and the way you encourage us and you challenge us. We're thankful for your body and the ways in which we can try and live out your kingdom. We ask for good rest and safe travel. In Jesus' name.